Back to this very special video where we are going to look at this exam, and we are going to go through the multiple choice questions that we had on our midterm, and we are going to look at some of the ones you guys struggled with, and we'll see maybe why you struggled. Now, I have to say that I'm not waiting until everyone's done because people are going to be writing until late this evening, and I do not plan to be at work late this evening. So this is just based upon the first 8 students writing, but it does give us some feedback. Let's look at some of the questions. We might not have time to look at all 32 questions, especially if some are ones that people are performing really well on, but we will look at some of the questions for sure. So let's begin with question number 1. So for question number 1, we had this source here to look at. So in the source you have individual efforts, and it's a non-unionist, and he's trying to get to better working conditions, but he's being held back by the weight of individual efforts. So this individual efforts is his obstacle to achieve this, and he identifies as a non-unionist, which is key for the question. So the question says supporters of the cartoonist from source 1 would respond to the cartoonist from 2. So now we have to go and look at the cartoon from 2 and say, okay, what's going on here? This one is suggesting that compulsory unionization is a bad thing, that the right to work is being taken away from the non-union working man. So this is anti-union because it's taking away the right to work. This is pro-union because it's only through unions that we can have better working conditions. So source 1's pro-union. I would write that right here if I had a paper copy, and here I would write anti-union. Going back to the question, supporters from or pro-unionists would respond to the anti-unionist cartoon with opposition because source 2 overlooks the benefits achieved through unions. So how do we unlock the answer to number 1? We have to first look at the 2 cartoons and figure out their ideological perspective. Here we can identify this as being pro-union because the non-unionist, because of his individual efforts, will never achieve better working conditions. And this is anti-union because the non-union working man is having his right to work taken away by the compulsory unionization. So by looking for elements within the 2 cartoons, the answer jumps off the page. It's not A because they both don't support the need for unions. So next up, question number 2. So number 2 says, which of the following individuals would most likely agree with the central message of source 2? Now, whenever I have 4 things like this as possible answers, I may decide to put them onto a spectrum. So a member of the NDP in Canada, that's to the left of center. A democratic socialist is to the left of center. A Keynesian economist is basically a moderate around the middle. And a free market enthusiast is a right-wing individual. So do I have a 3-1 split here? You could argue yes, that this one here is the only right-wing perspective shown. So before I even look at that source 2, I've done some pre-thinking, and I'm thinking that, you know what, D kind of stands out because there's a 3-1 split that these 3 have elements of collectivism. This one's an this one's going to be an individualist. So let's take a look and see how we can figure out it's a free market enthusiast that would most likely agree with the message of 2. Well, the message of 2 is unions are bad, that the non-working man is losing his right to work from unions. So the message of the cartoon is we should eliminate unions. And why would a free market enthusiast celebrate that? Well, unions can change the dynamics of the labor market, as through collective bargaining they may be able to dictate higher wages and more favorable terms of employment. And a free market enthusiast, most likely a capitalist, would not benefit from that. So who would disagree with who would likely agree, with the central message of source 2? The most likely person to agree with the idea that unions are bad is a free market enthusiast. So, first two questions are done there now. Now let's look at number 3. In the evolution of the American economy, Henry George's claim referenced within source 3 is illustrated when what happens. So now I'm going to go to the source 3 and see what his claim is, and then I'm going to think about the illustration. So I go to source 3, and it's a short quote, thank goodness, because there's some long stuff coming, isn't there? A rising tide doesn't rise all boats. So a rising tide doesn't raise all boats. Pretty familiar quote. We've talked about it. Now we got to say, okay, how does it fit? So we go back to the illustrations. Did we see that a rising tide doesn't raise all boats when Hoover argued that poverty was a local concern? Maybe. But when poverty was a local concern, was the tide rising? Not really, right? The economy, that quote is from the Great Depression, and the tide was actually going down. The economy was shrinking, and that's why A is not your best answer. B, although the U.S. economy grew, okay, tide is rising, the benefits of Reaganomics failed to trickle down. There's some boats that aren't benefiting. There's our answer. C, through the efforts of the invisible hand, a broad-based prosperity has been created. Sounds like all the boats are being rised up, so it's not C. D, the irrational and speculative nature of mankind creates an unstable bubble in the financial sector. That's more illustrating, instead of a tide rising, kind of a tsunami that's going to destroy everyone, to stay with that metaphor. All right, let's look at number 4. Of the following possible solutions to the issue presented in source 3, the one that would be most acceptable to a neoclassical liberal would be what? Of the following solutions to the issue presented in 3. So I'm going to have to go and say, what's the issue in 3? So there's going to be a little bit of reading here, and the issue, is disparity, right? So not a whole lot, because I thought we're moving on to a longer source. So the issue is disparity, the haves and have-nots. Of the following possible solutions to disparity, the one that would be most acceptable to a neoclassic lib, right? Someone who likes the free market. How do we make sure that there's more prosperity? What would a capitalist do? Increasing policing of the exploitative labor practices committed by industrialists? No. Neocons are the voice of the industrialists. Oversight agencies to watch for fraudulent behavior of corporations? Both C and D do the same thing. They regulate, they end up monitoring, holding back the capitalists. So if it's not D, it can't be C, because they're saying similar things. Progressive taxation to fund necessary fiscal reform. Fiscal reform and recovery would be more Keynesian, and neoclassic libs don't want to be paying taxes. They want to see very small government, hands-off business, right? Greater flexibility, hands-off business to allow prosperity to grow. That's what sounds most like Adam Smith, and neoclassic libs want to go back to Adam Smith. Our answer is A. Number 5. In a modern liberal economy like Canada, the roles credited to in source 4 to Henry Ford. So in the source, it's a long reading, but this is the one where it talks about how Henry Ford takes care of his workers, takes care of the poor. So who looks after the poor in Canada? That's the state, that's the government. That you could argue that most industrialists do not overcompensate their workers. That's why it's not A. Factories are not overcompensating. Most factory owners today are not paying 4, 5, 6 times minimum wage to people working very manual, unskilled work. Is it being ignored and we need a revolution? Only if you're a communist would you be saying that. No longer necessary due to the growth of unions. Unfortunately, we do still have poverty in Canada. Number 6. As a contemporary example that shows the governments have been more than just bemused by economics, but rather negligent in their role within the economy. So that the government wasn't doing their job. And because they didn't do their job, some economic problem happened. And we talked about the 2008 financial meltdown and how the government was negligent in that they weren't watching the flawed nature of mankind and they weren't watching for mankind involvement in the financial industry, creating the bubble and the subprime real estate, and fraudulently misreporting the profitability of these investments. So number 6, let's just skip ahead. I haven't been doing this, but let's just see, where did you guys go wrong on number 6? So it looks like most people did get number 6 right. So good work on number 6. Number 7, in context, which of the following phrases from source 4 would suggest that the government purposely ignored the flaws of laissez-faire capitalism? They deemed it unwise to be sane at a time when sanity exposed one to ridicule. So they deemed it unwise. They knew that they should be wise, but they said, you know what, we can't be wise, because if we are wise, we'll be ridiculed. So they deemed it unwise. They decided, right? The word deemed, right? We know that there is wisdom there. We know that there is something that could be seen as sanity. But we don't want to be sane because we will be exposed to ridicule. So they ignored the flaws of laissez-faire capitalism because they wanted to also avoid ridicule. So that one's a tougher question. That's one of those ones where you have to read in context, you have to slow down, you have to apply each of the other 4 answers, but we also have to look at the scenarios. In context, which of the following phrases from source 4 would suggest the government purposely ignored the flaws of laissez-faire capitalism? Number 8 was a question that I was surprised that you guys struggled on. So, American citizens would, following the Great Depression, be protected from the consequences of delusional optimism, described in source 4 through the. So what we have to do is go back to the Great Depression, go back to the conditions that caused it, and see, when did we see delusional optimism? And the delusional optimism was buying on the margin, the speculation on the stock market, and what alphabet agency directly dealt with the stock market and the security and the exchange of stocks? It's the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission. So number 8, people did struggle on it a little bit more than I thought, and one of the polls was the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, Glass-Steagall Act is more for regulating banking and the commercial and private banking, creating a separation. The delusional optimism coming from the investors. The investors are not the bankers. The investors are the people taking out the loans. That's why the SEC is the better answer. Number 9, information in the recollections within source 5 imply that the main concern of the Hoover government should have been reforming an economic system that had marginalized multiple groups. And number 9 is one of those reading comprehension questions that the majority of you got. If you didn't get it, what I would recommend that you do in terms of sources when you have a long source like that is slow down, read the questions, and then go back to the source and read in context. It takes a while. It does take a while. On the diploma exam, you can use double time again. So there's only 60 questions on the diploma exam. We only had 32 here today, and I gave you an even bigger window than you get on the diploma. So you should have lots of time. The readings on the diploma will not be quite as lengthy either. There'll be more of them though. Now number 10 is a question I'm a little frustrated that you guys didn't do as well on. So number 10, half of you ended up getting it wrong. And the poll for those who got it wrong was A. So let's go to the answers and see what happened there. So in the Canadian context, similar concerns to those shown in source 5 led to, so half of you said the R.B. Bennett implemented their New Deal, but R.B. Bennett didn't implement the New Deal. That's why he lost the 1935 election, and that's why the Liberal government under Mackenzie King implemented their New Deal. So half of you got number 10 wrong because you didn't know your history. So number 10 is not a skill question as much as it is a knowledge recall question. Did you understand the Canadian case study? Because of similar concerns to those shown in 5, in Canada we had workers that were protesting and went on the On to Ottawa trek. And we can go back to the source, source 5, and see those concerns. So looking through here, you got to say, what are the concerns? And the concerns are that unemployed people are idle. The concerns are that people are wanting or needing relief and recovery. The concerns are great poverty and despair and hunger. And yeah, R.B. Bennett did not come to the aid through a New Deal. It was the people who tried to get the government's attention, the workers, the discontented ones, on their On to Ottawa trek. Number 11. Which of the following headlines would most clearly relate to the situations described in source 5? So this is one of those matching questions where you have to weigh each of the possible answers, and it is a long source. So as you read through the source, highlight key terms, summarize things in the margin when you have a paper copy on the diploma exam, or in this case, have a scrap piece of paper next to you so that you can summarize some things and definitely go back to it. How did you guys do on number 11? Looks like very well. So good job with your reading comp. Number 12. After reviewing the reports contained within source 5, which of the following is the least likely conclusion that a Marxist would make? And I remember looking at this saying, what? So look at that. Boom, boom, boom. Nobody got it right. So this is like one of those red flags. Now, maybe some of our PM people will end up getting it right. But which of the following is the least likely conclusion that a Marxist would make? So Marxists, communists. Communists here, the reason why it's C, that the least likely conclusion that they would make is only once the most conservative elements within society realize they're exploited, the paradigm shift will begin. They're not waiting for the conservative individuals within society to realize they're being exploited, and it's only then when a communist revolution will start. The conservative members within society are not the drivers of the Marxist change. They're not the agents of Marxism. It's the workers who are the agents of Marxism. It's those who are being, exploited, their labor being exploited by the bourgeoisie and the class conflict. So, which of the following is the least likely conclusion that a Marxist would make? So let's look at the other three and think, would they say this? The treatment of the idle demonstrates how within a class system, the suffering of others will be ignored. So Marx focuses on class conflict, right? And how some are ignored or exploited. And in the article, they talk about the treatment of the idle and how the idle are basically marginalized. And that is a conclusion Marxists would make. Although the American economy is the greatest producer of wealth, it is also an unjust distributor of wealth. No, Marx would agree with that. He would say, yeah, you're creating great wealth, but there's a lot of poor people. So they wouldn't disagree with that. They would certainly make that statement. If the futility of the leaders inspires a growth in the number of communists, any government reform will not prevent an inevitable revolution. Wow, that's a complicated answer. If the futility of the leaders inspires a growth in the number of communists, any government reforms will not prevent an inevitable revolution. So, unfortunately for Marxists, they can see how the growth towards modern liberalism is slowing the paradigm shift, right? And the paradigm shift doesn't come to majority of the countries in the world. And we see that in the UK, the Chartists end up kind of borrowing from the socialist agenda and pressuring the government through the Factory Acts to create the change and reform liberalism from within. Let's go to number 13. You guys did really well with 13. For number 13, to get it right, you need to know what progressive taxation means. And it looks like you did. Number 14, the writer of source 6 critically indicates that as a consequence of government policies, again, I think maybe the culture of dependence term we used a lot in class, Maybe that's helped you out, but you definitely did a good job reading in context there. 15, we struggled on a little bit more, but still the majority picked the right answer for number 15. 15, when it says in response to source 6, being that rather than being indifferent, supporters of the principles of liberalism, so capitalists, would suggest that government is best when it establishes an atmosphere to promote investment and growth. So Adam Smith would argue, what is the role of government? Only to create legislation that protects private property and promotes a free market. And that's what B is saying. For number 16, let's go to see how many got it right. So again, we have about half of those from the AM group getting it right. In response to the claim in source 7 that the post-war era was a golden age, again, you need to know the terms and the time period here. Capitalists would argue that due to progressive taxation, the government disproportionately burdened the rich. So you got to be aware of what was happening at that time. And going back to source 7, the return to the right. And they're talking about the post-World War II age when taxes in America were, depending upon which bracket you were in, close to 100% the income taxes were. So that's the burden that's disproportionately burdening the rich. Taken in context, number 17, who's least likely the concerned academic? Well, we have a 3-1 split here. You have somebody on the left and 3 people on the right, so B kind of jumps out there. So would a socialist or a collectivist be least likely a concerned academic? Go back to the context there. And which source was it? Source 7. And again, the context here is that government is over penalizing corporations and the rich. So who would be least likely to be concerned about the corporations and the rich? The collectivist. And B is our answer. So how do we do better on that one next time? You guys did well. How do we do better? Cast of characters will help you. Number 18, when in source 11 it states that they did not starve the people to pay for America's industrialization, we can infer that this is an indirect attack of Stalin's starving of his workers, of the kulaks. So that's what's happening in that one, because it is a time of Cold War and it talks about the starvation down here. And it is that comparison between individualism and collectivism. It's a continuation of the defense of individualism that is here, an attack on collectivism, and then there's that indirect reference down there. Indirect attack of Stalin, starving his workers. Number 19, combining elements within sources 6 and 8, we can conclude that the cartoonist is suggesting that the once powerful influence of government policies are misstating the impact of FDR's policies. Let's see, how did you guys do on 19, 18, 19? Again, about half of you got it right. The once powerful influence of government policies are misstating the impact of FDR's policies. Let's go back. Source 6 and source 8. So 6... 6 is this long quote about the New Deal. So again, it's nice to be able to, in the margin, say, well, what is the ideological perspective here? And then source 8, kind of key to getting the question right, is looking at this cartoon. And you have some corporations. This is the 1%. These are the wealthy saying, boo-hoo, the New Deal is ruining the country. But yet, in the background, it's suggesting otherwise. In the background, it's suggesting that money is still being made. There's still lots of profit. So the cartoonist here is making fun of the corporations trying to suggest that FDR is somehow taking away their profit and ruining the country. So that was kind of key to finding the answer of that one. So the once powerful influence of government policy, corporations, are now misstating the impact of FDR's policies. They're misstating the impact because it's not really ruining the country. There's still profit being made. And how do we know they're the once powerful influence? Because before, in the other source, it's talking about the power of corporations to influence government. So it's a multi-step answer, and many of them will be. So that's why we have to take the questions, step by step. Based upon the contents of the garbage can from source 9, we can conclude something. So we've got to go look at the garbage can. And then, you zoom into the garbage can and it says things like chicken in every pot, rugged individualism, prosperity is around the corner, car in every garage, grand old party policies, the commission form of government. So this is what's being thrown out. FDR is throwing these things out. Herbert Hoover has a new job. He's been fired from being the president. FDR is the new president. He's throwing out Hoover's policies, right? It's March of 1933. So March 1933, FDR is going to bring in the New Deal. That's the context of the cartoon. Based upon the context of the cartoon, we conclude that capitalists would see FDR's actions as unwarranted because you're throwing out the core American values, like rugged individualism. That's a core value of America. Number 21, to continue the ideological perspective of source 10, so that's source 10, you got the New Deal, and you got these guys that are pretty happy about it, government-backed labor barons, self-perpetuating political barons, and the policies we're going to redistribute wealth. They're all quite excited about this New Deal. The New Deal, this is what comes with it. This is the public face of the New Deal, but in reality, this is what FDR is really introducing. This is the support or the power behind it. What number are we on here? To continue the ideological perspective, to complete the labeling of the figures, who would these people be? Well, we do look at them, right? Look at them. This guy's wearing a little academic hat. This guy's wearing like a middle class or some kind of businessy suit. Utopian dreamers and communists, right? There was a poll to this: sympathetic intellectuals and marginalized laborers. Now, looking at the elements here, I don't see either of these being drawn in a way that they were marginalized. They would be drawn as like they were poor, like they were hurt, or that they've been disadvantaged. If this guy had been drawn like he had been disadvantaged, I could see how you might say that this could be a sympathetical intellectual, but he doesn't look like a marginalized worker. So, source 11 is the illustration of concern that's been expressed by, so source 11. This comes straight out of our lesson on the New Deal. FDR, the executive branch of the government, Congress, the legislative branch of government, and he wants more power. And this is FDR threatening the separation of power, the checks and balances, and that comes straight from Montesquieu. So that should have been a simple recall question right out of the first chapters of the textbook, but people struggled on it. Of the first 8 people that wrote, no one got it right. So go back and know your philosophers. That's the answer to that question. Number 23. Looks like most of you got number 23 right, as did you with number 24. Number 25 gets a little harder. So let's take a peek at number 25. Same set of sources here. So there's lots to read through. So definitely, taking some notes while you're reading through it so you don't read through it 10 times is probably helpful. Question number 25 is asking, the government at the time of source 13 is most likely practicing an economic policy of essentially planned economy on the left, supply side on the right, mixed and Keynesian in the middle. Mixed and Keynesian mean basically the same thing, so it's probably either C or D. So I go back to source 13 and say, well, what are they practicing here? Source 13, you have cut spending and support corporations. That's the essence of supply side economics. So I am a little alarmed that majority of you got that one wrong. So that one was meant to be one of the easier questions on the exam. And therefore, I would say that you need to create, a better list of vocabulary terms like supply side economics, and attach to your vocab terms a little summary. What does it mean? What is supply side economics? And supply side economics was cutting spending on social programs, but also cutting taxes on the rich. And as we saw with Reagan, he didn't cut the military budget, he actually kept feeding the military budget. So rather than cutting the budget here, they cut the budget there, and that was the main criticism of Reaganomics. Number 26, number 27, number 27, let's take a look at that one then. Number 27. In response to sources 12 and 13, what would a collectivist argue? So 13, we have a collectivist wouldn't be happy with this, right? A collectivist would say this is not in the common good, that a collectivist would suggest that the government's been corrupted by the elite. And then in 12, we'd have to go back and read this and go through the language and see what's happening. Society is now fragmented. We have been left with no higher aims, no greater social goals. We no longer live with our neighbors in solidarity. Collectivists would agree with that, right? We have been left feeling isolated and alone, and sometimes this inspires sociopathic reactions. The fruits of this is what we call narcissism or self-absorption. That certainly sounds like something a collectivist might say. The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use the wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of American civilization. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. That also sounds a little like a collectivist, right? So let's go back to the question. In response to the two sources, a collectivist would argue that the policy in 12, the Great Society, never achieved its goals, and American society remains fragmented. And we see the fragmentation of society in the fact that it's this class against this class. Collectivists, Marxists would say we still have class warfare. That you said you're going to be able to provide, a great life for all, and therefore get past this inevitable class conflict that Marxists say as you create a great society. But this shows you haven't created a great society. We still have wealth being basically the monopoly of some. That wealth is being held by some at the expense of others. Canada avoided the concerns from source 14 largely due to what? So we got to go to source 14 and say, okay, what's happening here? The sentries were not at their posts, in no small part due to the widely accepted faith in the self-correcting nature of the markets. Markets can correct themselves. We used to have some sentries, but we took them away. So there's nobody watching these markets. Mankind can correct itself, and the ability of financial institutions to effectively police themselves. Now I got to think of what's a case study where we saw financial institutions being allowed too much freedom. They create a crisis. And why was that possible? Canada did not, as the United States do, right? So Canada avoids the problem. We didn't deregulate the financial industry. We continued to regulate it. So because we didn't deregulate the financial industry, the 2008 financial meltdown was not as deep here in Canada. Therefore, the answer to number 28 is largely due to the continued regulation of the industry. All right, and to be honest, you guys did well in the last four. 29, 30, 31, and 32. The last four were all based upon that chart there. And yeah, so good work on the chart. So, ladies and gentlemen, obviously I have to wait. I can't release this video right now because we still have some students writing. Wouldn't that be a treat? Hey, here's the answer, everybody. But I will give you guys this on Monday. Have a good week. I hope you had a good weekend.